Alright, hello, welcome everybody. Today we have, as we have finished with all of the factions available to us, in Total War Warhammer 3 at least, for now, we are going to be looking at their laws of magic, as that is the next most appropriate area before Immortal Empires comes out. And we just have to deal with every single law of magic on this page. That'll be fun. Not. Let me just post this link in the Discord. Alright, that's through. Alright, so we shall get started here. As for the top, oh yeah, Yang and Yin as well. I'm going to put that to the description real quick. I'll do that actually after. So we're going to start here with what is probably one of the worst on this list, I think. Law of Yang. This is one of the two laws available to Grand Cathay. Consists of a couple of spells that are quite subpar. Just going through them, Jade Shield, of course, is a pretty solid spell, plus 44% damage resistance to 4 winter magic. That is pretty good if you ever want a unit to hold for just longer, because you have to bear in mind that's damage resistance just flat out, so that cannot be bypassed in any way. It's not physical resistance, it's not some special kind of resistance, it's all damage is just reduced by 44%. So placing this on, just, you want to be casting this preferably as much as you possibly can, just because that is really good value. This is probably one of the best spells in this law, and it is one you'd want to use a lot. If you upgrade it, you get an extra 14 seconds, no, 11 seconds duration. That is pretty reasonable, but then you have to overcast it. Yeah, you could probably risk overcasting this. It's a pretty decent spell. It's one of the ones Law of Yang has going for it. Dragon's Breath is pretty bad. It suffers the same problem that we'll see with other breath spells, in that it has no AP, and there's quite a bit of armored stuff in that you'll be going up against. Warriors of Chaos are like Chaos Warriors of Khorne. This will do like nothing against. Slanesh will move too quickly. Zinch won't care, and Nurgle, you'll do such a small amount of their HP they'll hardly even notice. Ogres just won't do anything against. Sure, this will do well against Noblars and like the really cheap infantry, but that's not a great spell, and Cathay doesn't have a problem dealing with cheap infantry. They really need to deal with some of that more expensive armoured infantry that they have an issue with. Overcasting it does give you some more damage, but again, it's not AP, which is the main issue. You really want some AP damage, which we'll get onto why there's certain spells that are really good, because they have complete AP. But this one is pretty meh, pretty mid. Alexis is in chat, loving magic, as always. Another thing, again, we'll see here that as a base version, Wall of Wind of Fire is a very slow-moving wind spell. That's already pretty bad. Slow-moving wind spells don't typically do very well. And it's a slow-moving wind spell with 0 AP. So, again, this is just something to take out some of that more lightly infantry. But again, light infantry will probably be moving quickly, so it could probably just move away from this. And it's got quite a slow movement speed of 3 meters per second. That is like... most infantries move faster than that in comparison. It's got some good damage output if you get it across the area that you want it to and it completely hits everything. That is such a perfect scenario that it's just not a great spell compared to other wind spells like Burning Head or a Pendulum, for instance. This is just nowhere near what those are capable of. Now you could say it's a pretty cheap one as well, but so is Dragon's Breath. It's like this one and Dragon's Breath are so similar, you'd question why you'd bother bringing both. You'd bring one or the other. Upgrading it, you do get some AP, but it's like that's quite a minor amount. It's only 33%. Next, Stone Guard Stance. This is something that you basically apply to a front line of infantry. You apply it to a unit, it makes them more resistant to getting knocked around, basically. This is the spell that you want to cast when you're up against like a Stone Horn, or you're up against some very big single entities or large monstrous infantry, so that your infantry don't get flattened. Because most Cathay infantry will get flattened by everything. This helps. In my experience, this has never done that much. It helps, but you can only usually put it on one unit. If you overcast it, it gives an area of effect, but it's kind of awkward to pull off. You need to be timing it well, and then if your opponent is running you into you with big monstrous creatures, they could probably just go and hit a unit that isn't affected by this. And it only lasts 24 seconds. That's not that long for 8 winds of magic, it's not too helpful. It's something that you can take into consideration if you're dealing with big, large creatures, but meh, it's not going to help much. The leadership is mainly just there so you don't get terror out immediately. Might of Heaven and Earth. This is a single target buff that you just imbue into a unit, giving them flaming attacks, magical attacks. So basically magical attacks there for fighting demons, as well as some bonus damage and melee attack. So this is a pretty solid buff. It's like Flaming Sword of Ruin, but it gives melee attack and it's only on one unit. In that instance, Flaming Sword of Ruin is still better. I think it's the same cost as Flaming Sword of Ruin. Flaming Sword of Ruin was actually cheaper. It's like you compare this to Flaming Sword of Ruin, so you don't get the melee attack, but you get an augmented area instead of just a single target, which is what this one gives. You can get some pretty big buffs if you apply it to a single unit, but it lasts a good 30 seconds. The issue is that Cathay doesn't have that many standoutish units that you want to apply this on. It's like you could apply this on your one unit of Jade Warriors, or really your Longma Riders would probably be what you go for most of the time. It's a pretty decent buff. It's just that it's very focused. It's 11 winds of magic for a single target, which isn't the best. There's not ever been that many good buff spells that are single target. It's decent, but it's not quite up to par with what other spells have going for them. Constellation of the Dragon is finally you get a bit of AP going on. Only 33% again, but it is just your basic single target explosion. It does really big damage and it does come down pretty quickly, but 18 winds of magic for that is madness. That is a lot of winds of magic. You compare this to like Pit of Shades. Where's Lord of Shadow? There's Pit of Shades does 50% AP. It's 13 winds of magic, unlike the 18 winds of magic that this is, and this lasts way longer and will end up doing more damage. And it also does a oh sorry that was off. It's 100% AP Pit of Shades, and as long as assuming the target stays in there for the whole duration, which is going to happen because it's pretty much a suck-in effect. This is just better in nearly every single way, and it activates quicker. There is not an awful lot of reason. This does have a larger radius, which is nice, of 20 meters instead of 15 meters that Pit of Shades has, but it's just not that worth it. 18 winds of magic is a lot of winds of magic. Another one you can compare it to is probably just Purple Sun. Same thing, but Purple Sun will last longer and it'll move around. It may only have a 12 meter radius, but when it's moving around in a sort of like weird circular shape, you tend to hit more than that, way more than that than you want. So as a whole, I do think that Law of Yang is probably the worst law. Not in terms of every law, just in terms of the ones we're covering today. It is probably the bottom of the pile. It's not great. It doesn't have very much standoutish spells. Most of the time you're just going to be taking Yin. Which we can compare to with Yin, just going on to it now. Your Yin has a slow effect, which for four winds of magic, you're reducing something by 50% speed, which is, generally speaking, it's going to do a lot more than Stone Guard stances for like slowing down an enemy unit. And this is guaranteed. There's no way they can just move around your unit. You can overcast it for a more area effect in case you've got like a big enemy group of cav that you want to slow down. But as a whole, you usually single target because people can just move away from the affected unit. But like a 50% drop, especially when you put that on like a Slanesh unit, that drops their speed by 50. It's big. And again, 4 winds of magic is pretty good. Well, I will quickly touch on the fact that Law of Yang, the passive effects. Where is it? Mr. Yangcaster or Misters or whatever. So the Yang bonus, is it this one? Yeah, basically the Yang bonus is around the caster. Everything gets a bonus to like damage. It's only lasts 13 seconds, so it's very minimal. And it only happens around the caster, which granted in the current form, the caster you get or you're going to bring is one that you'd have in melee most of the time because you'd put them on a Longma Rider. But it's not the best passive effect there is around, especially when you compare it to the Yin passive effect, which is, where is it? This one, which just reduces the enemy's armor and speed of everything in a radius, which is a lot more useful for like a caster or for something that's going to be more centralized into things than the damage bonus. Not to mention that Law of Yin, if we go back to the spells, just has some better spell kits. So now it's Storm of Shadows. Cloak of Jet is a typical sort of stealth. It's a bit unique actually. Is you target a single target and it gives it snipe, stalk, and unspottable. This basically means the unit is very hard to see. This means your unit, like, you have to be right in front of the enemy in order for them to see it. Snipe means that they won't even reveal themselves while shooting, which is handy for some Cathay units. Kind of a weird one to cast. You can definitely have some situations where it's useful, although it's not that useful. It's definitely got some very unique potential, but there's not a lot of instances where you bring this and you get a really good use out of it. At least not in the current state of affairs. I think maybe when Warhammer 3 comes out, you'll have more instances to like hide from artillery and like counterfire. Of course, Cathay doesn't have much problems with that in its current form, so this isn't too much of an effort, a thing you need. You can overcast it and it'll last a full minute, which is nice. 76 words of magic as well. Again, I think it's very situational, but it has its possibilities. Blossom Wind is another slow moving. I mean, it's nowhere near as. It's actually a lot quicker. This is like Wind of Death level speeds. You can see it fly through there. It does 100% AP, which is automatically way better than the Law of Yang version, even if it has a much narrower area of effect. It also applies Blinded. Now, if I remember rightly, this also only affects enemies, so you can run this through a melee and only affect the enemy side, which 10 seconds they're reduced by that much. It's pretty decent. Throwing this on nearly any enemy front line is going to do some nasty work. It's not only going to do a good chunk of damage, but it's also going to give them a nasty debuff for 10 seconds. And it has a good, like, it goes through pretty much our whole unit, as you can see there. Overcasting it will increase the damage by even more. 24 armor piercing damage is pretty good. That's like half the health of an average model, which is assuming it hits all the models. It's going to take like half the unit's health off. And as a whole, it's a decent wind spell, at least when you're comparing it to the Yang ones like Dragon's Breath and Wall of Wind and Fire. This is just a overall better spell, in my personal opinion. Yeah, so it's definitely something you can bring. Yeah, obviously you don't bring it against like ogres or anything, even for the debuff. You're not bringing this for the debuff, you're bringing it for the mixture of the two, but it's a solid pick. Missile Mirror, this is the one everyone saw in the trailers and everyone sees in like the pre-informational videos. This reflects missile fire back at whoever's shooting at you. So you cast it on a unit and that unit's missile attacks will just fly right back in their face. This is pretty fun spell. 10 Winds of Magic is pretty expensive, considering it might be easier just to kill the unit that's shooting. But it's decent. I think the issue is that a lot of people have wizened onto it by now, and so when people see that it's affecting their unit, they can just stop firing. Because that's all the spell does, is you literally just stop shooting. You can get extended cast range if you overcast it, but again, that's 15 Winds of Magic for that. It's only really I think when Warhammer 3 comes out, there'll be more artillery and stuff against like cannons and stuff. This will obviously just kill the cannons. Assuming they fire a volley, that should just blast back in their face and kill them, hypothetically at least. So there's definitely some factions that you might bring this against. Currently in Warhammer 3, there isn't really. Even like flamers, you can typically just stop firing. Like a flamer firing itself in the face is pretty bad, but also flames aren't very good against Cathay, so you just don't usually see them in that match very often. So as a whole, like, it's something people have wizened onto, but maybe when Warhammer 3 releases, we'll see it being used a bit more. Talons of the Night. This is a Pit of Shades, basically. It's very good. I think it's nearly identical to a Pit of Shades. It's very, very similar to a Pit of Shades. It's got the usual pull-in effect the Pit of Shades has. It does fully armor-piercing damage. It has a decent duration. It's got a huge stationary effect. It is a very good single stationary vortex spell. Against all the problems that Cathay have, Cathay has an issue with big, armoured, scary infantry. And Talons of the Night just fucking demolishes them. So it's a pretty good spell to have in your arsenal. Overcasting it just increases the damage, doubles it. It doesn't have the extended duration, which is usually better because the enemy can move out of it a bit more. So this just flat out increases damage by doubling it. Now it is 21 Winds of Magic, which is a lot. The base version is only 14, but you do double the effectiveness most of the time. And that obviously scales with Spell Mastery, which Cathay has going for them, which means you can get some really good damage going off on this. You can easily delete Chaos Warriors of Khorne. It's a pretty good one to have in your arsenal if you're worried about those masses of infantry, which most Warhammer 3 factions do anyway. Now, Ancestral Warriors, I'd say, is probably the best spell in this lore. It's the reason why it's so much better than Yang, is that it's a summon. We all know from Warhammer 2 that summon spells are really good. And Ancestral Warriors is no different. It summons a unit of spectral elite halberd infantry, I forget what they're called, like Celestial Dragon Guard. It summons a spectral unit of those. Now you may say spectral units aren't very good because there's demons in it and everything, but you don't care, because these things will just kill everything anyway. And the fact that they're spectral also means they have magic attacks. And obviously they're a summoned unit, so you don't care so much if they die, because they're summoned. If your enemy's focusing their attention on trying to get rid of them, then they're dumb. Now it is a big expensive summon, which aren't the best, but it is still a summon, which I've always been quite good. So just being able to plonk this down and summon 2 units of these really, really good infantry, really, really solid. They'll beat most elite infantry in combat because they're ethereal and they have AP and they have anti-large as well, so they can tie down those really big monstrous infantries as well. So yeah, it's a pretty good spell. You don't want to overcast it just for extra range. For 22 winter magic, that's not worth it. Looking at the Kislev laws, so we've got Law of Ice. Law of Ice here, I believe, has the slow effect on its passive. If we take a look at Kislev, Law of Ice's passive is it's the Frost Shield one, yeah. So this just increases the armor and missile block chance of your allies. It's probably one of the worst passive effects. Like missile block chance isn't really needed at all, and armor is mid at best. Spells wise, we see another slow here. This one's just a base augment. You can't actually overcast this one, which is weird enough. Just reduces speed by 25%. For 4 winds of magic, 25% speed reduction on an area of 55 meters is pretty okay. It lasts 17 seconds as well. So you just basically cast this on the enemy's front line so that you can get some more volleys on them before they arrive. It's a pretty decent spell. It's 4 winds of magic. There's not too much to complain about. If you think you've got some situations to use it, use it. Looking at Breath spell, Ice Maiden's Kiss. You'll notice this is quite similar to the Dragon's Breath that we covered. Dragon's Breath does more damage. It is also generally a slower cast, I think. But Ice Maiden's Kiss is you're mainly bringing it for the slow effect. The reason this one is brought a lot more than like the Law of Yang one is this is your primary source of like AoE damage in Law of Ice, at least. Like this is pretty much, there's no other vortex. So you got Heart of Winter, but as a whole, Ice Maiden's Kiss is what you're using to try and clear out some chief infantry with before they reach the front line. It does also have that slow effect, which is okay, but again, this is a pretty not great breath spell. I wouldn't recommend you using it all too much if you can avoid. Frostblades. This is like very similar to what we've seen from Might of Heaven and Earth. It's just a lesser version of it. It has exactly the same, except from it doesn't apply the fire damage. Which, when you think about it, this just makes this better, because fire damage is really not that helpful. And for 4 extra winds of magic, you're better off just with the magic damage as it is. It is single target again, which we all know single target spells are a bit meddling to have because you can only put it on 1 unit, and Cathay doesn't have anything so standoutish that you'd want to apply it to. Ice Guard already have magic attacks, and you could apply it to like Zargard, I suppose, but they're more defensive, so it's not an amazing spell because Kislev laws are just not the best, unfortunately. Overcasting it increases the effect as per normal. 10 minutes of magic is okay. Death Frost, this is your direct damage spell. Strong against characters. It does an okay amount of damage. It's very much like Spirit Leech, but worse because it's 14 winds of magic instead of the only 8. Like 34 to 67. And then this one is 34 to 67. It is literally just a more expensive Spirit Leech. I think the trade-off is that it has a longer duration, so it does more damage, slightly. Where is it? Comparison. So this one lasts for 20 seconds, and Spirit Leech lasts for 13. Spirit Leech could also be overcasted to increase the damage, or is it damage, or is it just range? Yeah, it's just range. So you could definitely compare it to, like, I feel insulted comparing this to Spirit Leech, but it is pretty much Spirit Leech. It's not that much worse, I'll be honest to it. It is just, even the overcast is extended cast range, but 14 winds of magic compared to the 8. And also Law of Death had a way better passive than Law of Ice does. And also I think in its current stance there's not a lot of amazing targets for this. There's a couple, but nothing like Spirit Leech had. Your Lord isn't also as mobile as a Vampire Council Lord could be. It's okay. It's a worse Spirit Leech. It's more expensive. You could say it's a bigger version of Spirit Leech, but it's okay. Crystal Sanctuary. This is just a bad spell. There's not many good things that make your units unable to move. Now you could say, oh, it's 60% damage resistance. Let's go to Law of Yang. Jade Shield has 44% damage resistance. It's only 4 Winds of Magic. So for this, you're paying an extra 8 Winds of Magic for an extra 16%. That's not worth it. Oh, but then you also can't move. Now you could say it's a longer duration. This is bad. The longer duration is bad here, because it being 35 seconds means the enemy can just move away from your unit, and you can't move it for 35 seconds. You are netting your own unit down for 35 seconds. That is really not good. Like, you might apply this to your Lord if they're in a situation that they can't get out, but then if an opportunity comes that they can get out, they can't anymore because they're stuck for 35 seconds. Overcasting it increases it to an area of effect so that you can net all of your units instead of just one. It's not a great spell. If you made this like 100% damage resistance, there could be some use for it, but 60% isn't even. It's just not worth it. It just makes your unit stand still for 35 seconds. At best. Heart of Winter is a pretty nice little area effect damage. As you can see, it scales up as it persists. It lasts a full duration of this, so it's was that 32 seconds. By the end of it, it's doing huge amounts of damage, but it is mainly for dealing with infantry stacks. But as you can see, for this first 8 seconds, it doesn't have slow effect. So I think the idea of it is that during that first stage, your enemy will have like 8 seconds to get out of it before they slowly start taking more damage and get like slowed and slowed and slowed. It's a pretty good direct damage spell. It is also 24 Winds of Magic, which is absolutely ludicrous. There's a lot of Winds of Magic, and it does do really good damage. But if you don't get exactly like 3 units of infantry, you're probably not paying for it. You're spending all your Winds of Magic on this. Overcasting it, I think, increases the damage even more, but then it's up to 28 Winds of Magic. A very flashy spell. Like, you're going to drain the entire enemy army if they're standing in this, but they have to be standing in it. And there are Vortex spells which do better and don't require your enemy to stand still for an extended period of time. So it's very much similar to the Law of Life spell, just way more damaging. The Law of Life spell being Dwellers Below. This has pretty similar effect, except from this just applies a flat slow through its duration, unlike that, which slowly has to ramp up. It also has, I think this one has a way bigger area of effect. But as it stands, that is just too much magic for a spell, man. 24 Winds of Magic is madness. Law of Ice, not great. It's slightly better than Yang, I think, but only slightly. I think you could compare the two. But I think as a whole, people just take Law of Tempest. But similar to how you take Law of Yin as Cathay, you take Law of Tempest as usually as Kislev. If we take a look here at the passive effect. Where is it? There you go, Freezing Winds. That is a 25% slow, and it's map wide. That passive effect is already better than the other 3 we've combined. It's like it being map wide and it reducing the enemy speed by a quarter. And it's not even on the ice, the slowdown spells. This is on just Tempest, of being a bit windy, and it slows them down by 25%. That's really good. That's a really good passive effect. Spell-wise, it's pretty good. It's quite average for what you'd consider a spell kit. Gust of True Flight increases again, this is a single target buff, but it's ranged, so you've got some more variability going on there. It increases its range by 30%, which can be quite good for, especially for artillery units, and accuracy by 30, which is really big. Overcasting it makes it an area of effect of 35 meters for only 8 Winds of Magic at the overcast and 4 Winds of Magic at the base. This is one of the better, really cheap spells. You put this on a unit of Shrelty, you'll see its damage increase by a good like 25%, which is worth it. And if you overcast it on 3 units of Stealthy, you'll delete anything that walks in front of you. So Ghost of Truth Light is a pretty decent spell. If you're bringing ranged units, or if you're bringing the higher end of ranged units, like Ice Guard and Stealthy, I'd bring this one. Hailstorm, bombardment spell. We don't see many of these. Only 6 winds of magic. It's got a little explosion as well as its range damage. 33% armor piercing. We said it's okay. It's very similar to the Law of Metal. What's it called? Searing Doom. Very similar to that. In fact, nearly identical to that. They like to make similar spells. It's even the same winds of magic cost. And, you know, it's a pretty decent damage spell. You throw this on a unit, it's going to do some damage to it, and you'll be happy about it. 6 winds of magic is really inoffensive. And typically speaking, bombardments aren't too easy to dodge. You usually want to put this down on a unit that's standing still, and they won't be able to get out of it. Overcasting it, I think, increases the number of missiles and the effect duration, basically meaning if you plant this on a location, it's just going to do more damage, but over a bit more of a time. Pretty good. Again, a really inoffensive, moderate spell. Usually you want to bring this one. Swift Wing, on the other hand, this is on the less good end of the Tempest, probably the worst spell in this list. It increases speed and charge bonus of all your units in area. It's a 35-meter area, so the idea, if you increase it with the overcast, the idea is, I suppose, you put this on your cavalry or your chariots. Charge bonus plus 40%. Kislev isn't that focused on the charging aspect of their cavalry. The cavalry's pretty good in melee as it is. And it's also always hard to pull off. I think the main thing is it's always hard to pull off spells like this. You have to be casting it on all your cavalry, and then you have to make sure your cavalry is close enough together that all of it gets the buff, and then you need to make sure that you time it so that you can get like 1 or 2 charges with that group of cavalry whilst this is still in effect. It's nice on the charge, it increases charge bonus, but that's really all you're bringing it for. You're not using it on infantry anytime soon, so it's pretty mid. Biting Wind, this is a okay wind spell, quite similar to the Blossom Wind one. It moves about the same speed as well. 30% armor piercing is it's again running into the problem that it doesn't have that much AP. Overcasting it does increase it to 40%, 50% even, and for 36 damage per second, that's pretty good. Like average, I think average model like health on a unit is something like 50 or something. So this is taking up, is it 50? Might be talking in my ass there, let me think. 50, yeah, 50-ish. More like between 50 and 100. So 36 is taking out a good chunk of it, but 17 winds of magic, very expensive for a breath spell that doesn't actually do all that much damage. It's not that great. If you want to be picking off the enemy, just do it with Hailstorm instead. Hawks of Miska. This vortex spell, now you notice it doesn't do any armor piercing damage. It applies a discourage effect, which reduces enemy leadership by 16, which is really big. This is Doom of Darkness on a vortex spell, which it's all too easy to trigger with. Now, this spell is pretty good, surprisingly. Not so much against demons, because demons don't run and they typically have high morale. You want to be using this against like ogres, surprisingly enough. Even against like 16, minusing 16 leadership is, if you can make the enemy run, you can run them down and then you kill them. So applying this onto like ogres surprisingly have pretty low leadership, especially like the mid-tier ogres. And Cathay, as we know, has really low leadership, just flat out. Of course, this doesn't do very much to Kislev, and the best part of it is that it doesn't affect your own troops. So if you have a unit fighting like 4 units around it, as long as that unit that you have there is like fear, or it's holding pretty well, the chances are, if you cast this, it's going to make the enemy rout to your 1 unit. And then that 1 unit can just chase all 4 of those units off. This works really nicely with like a cavalry build, because then you can just run them down with like some cheap cavalry. Yeah, it's a pretty decent vortex spell. It's quite unique in the fact that you're not really using it for the damage as much as you are using it for that discourage effect. Similar to like Doom of Darkness. Overcasting it increases damage, but like I said, you're not really using it so much for the damage. And 13 Winds of Magic is pretty nice and cheap for it. Like, you compare it to Biting Wind, I'd use this over Biting Wind like most of the time, even against the armored targets, because if you can make them run, you can just slaughter them. Now Blizzard is for those armored targets. It is a vortex spell very similar to Pit of Shades. Instead of having a pulling effect, it's got a slow, so it's more like Dwellers are below. As a whole, it's very expensive. It does do decent damage, but again, 18 winds of magic for how expensive it is. You'd be better whittling off with the Hailstorm and Hawks of Miska to make them run away. If the enemy has like a bunch of stuff blobbed up, then you might want to use this, but typically you aren't seeing that in very many situations. So as a whole, I think like these three here, Hawks of Miska, Hailstorm and Gust of True Flight are the standout ones. The other three you don't bring that much. Alright, that is it for the good guys. Time to move on to the villains. Let's be honest, they're villains. First, Law of the Great Maw. Now, Ogres, quite unique in the fact that they have 3 laws available to them, unlike the other ones that only have 2. They have Law of Beasts, Law of the Maw, and also the Law of Fire. Now, Law of Fire is pretty good, but Law of the Maw is also very good. The passive effect is healing, which is really good. We know from experience, I think that's the same as Law of Vampires has. It's a very good passive effect to have. Just being able to heal when you cast is really good. Even if it just affects your Lord, which I'm pretty sure is what it does. Yes. Yeah, it just heals your Lord. That's still pretty good. That means you can save heals on your Lord and put them on other units instead. It is a pretty chunky heal as well. So not quite as good as Law of Vampires, but you know, healing's nice. Brain Gobbler, as we mentioned before, 16 leadership reduction is really good. It works quite well for ogres because you want the enemy to run so that you can fill up your effect. The issue is, of course, it doesn't work too well against demons because they don't run. And Kislev also don't run. So really this is only good against Cathay or the Mirror Match. Either or, you're probably not running into too often. So for those 2 matchups, it's a bouquet spell. Everything else is kind of useless. Of course, in Warhammer 3, you might see this being used a bit more. Overcasting it increases the duration for a longer effect, which, I mean, assuming your enemy's broke, you should just be running them down at that point. If it's got to the point where you haven't broke them after 18 seconds, you probably shouldn't be casting this spell. So it's just not very good in the meta. I think we'll see it more used in times to come. Bullgorger, it's a single target buff. It's okay. The fact that your passive heals your Lord helps this a bit. 24 melee attack is okay. It's very inoffensive. It's a 4 winds of magic single target buff. It's not that much to write home about, but it's something you can cast whenever you have 4 winds of magic left. Toothcracker. Oh, I should mention overcasting this increases the effect duration, which, you know, that's what a single target buff usually does anyway. Toothcracker increases it's an area effect. Friendly targets increases armor and missile resistance. Ogres do have a problem getting shot at because they're so big, and so this can come in handy. Overcasting it increases the effect duration once again. If you're going so long as that you need to have this active for 50 seconds, you probably should be more worried about the ranged targets that have been shooting you for 50 seconds than the fact that you have to resist them for that long. So normally you're just using this on like the charge or that first initial engagement so that you can absorb a bit more of that damage. But the idea with ogres is ideally to shut down those ranged units as quickly as possible. The armor, of course, you don't really need in the front line too much, as your ogres will just smush things into dust. So, okay spell, really against only those like ranged factions like Tzeentch. Of course, most of Tzeentch is an AP, so that helps a bit more. But it's okay. Bone Crusher, this is a single target explosion. You'll notice just how leagues beyond this is compared to like the spells of Yang. Like if you take a look at this, 64 damage, 10 winds of magic. No, that's a bad example. Where's the other one that's 10 winds of magic? Oh, it is. We can take a look at this one. So Biting Wind, 26 for 12 winds of magic. 10 winds of magic, 64. And you could argue, of course, this is going through more units, and typically you can hit all the models in a unit. A lot of the time you can hit quite a bit with this spell. As long as you're paying attention for those perfect opportunities, this will smush. This is literally you casting Fist on a unit. It also has 50% magic, armor piercing, which is pretty good. Overcasting it, you increase it to 96 damage, which will 9 times out of 10 kill any infantry model, besides like the big chunky Nurgle ones. So that's pretty good, just being able to smush your opponent's infantry. Especially because ogres have a sort of an issue with like really big expensive halberds because nobody wants to fight that. You just smush them. You just crush them and then you move on. It's a very nice single target, just smush spell. You'd want to bring it mostly. Troll Guts. A heal. We all know how good healing is by Lore of Life and Lore of Vampires. And this is no difference. Now, it doesn't resurrect or anything. It doesn't restore vigor. But it is a really big heal. Like, it lasts for 40 seconds and it's almost 1% per second. So this is about a 35% heal. That's a pretty big proportion of health. Especially when you consider, like, Stone Tusks have over 10,000 HP. You're restoring, like, about 4,000 HP. Just to a single model for 16 wounds of magic, really good. If we take a look and compare it to Lore of Life, that old famous spell, where is it, Regrowth? So Regrowth does 0.8% and it does the Vigor, which is nice, and it lasts 29 seconds, whereas this one actually gets off more healing, but doesn't have the Vigor reduction. No improvement, but I think Lore of Life one is also cheaper. Regrowth only 13, yeah. Now if you overcast this, it increases it to 52 seconds. This is pretty much a full heal. This is going to hit your healing cap. If you're overcasting this, you basically just want to fully heal a single model, which makes this perfect in tandem with like Stonehorns and such. Really good usage in that sort of area. But of course, it doesn't resurrect, so you don't usually want to use this on a unit that doesn't have all of its models left. And that is a lot of winter magic for a spell, as I've been over before. Lastly, I think we will leave the demon laws for next time, but we will cover Lore of the Maw. This is a really big explosion. It's not as AP as Bone Crusher, but as you can see, it can reach the same sort of damage area of effect, and it's got a way larger AoE. This will hit like a good 1, 2, maybe 3 units at once. Again, it's very expensive, and it's not fully armor piercing, which is an issue because ogres don't have an issue killing things that are lightly armored. If they did, they'd have a rough time. It's more if your enemy has like a lot of their ranged units come together, you can drop this and just flatten them. But it's not the best, and it's very expensive. 9 times out of 10 you can get Bone Crusher to just do its job. Just casting it like 3 times instead. So yeah, as a whole, Lore of the Great Maw is pretty good. The heal is very helpful. You do get a heal with an army ability, of course, but it is a pretty decent Lore of Magic. Bone Crusher is a very nice explosion, and the other ones are just, decent. Okay, there's nothing that's too awful in this roster as it is. I think things will change with Warhammer 3 Immortal Empires, but we'll have to wait and see. So that is it for the Laws of the Mortals. Next session, we shall go over some Laws of Demons. And I should also have some instances of being able to show those as well. So, thank you all for watching, and I'll see you